my panellists will be discussing where we should draw the line when it comes to the right to identify. Scarlett Maguire, what do you reckon?
I think the whole thing about children identifying as different genders, animals, cake, it's just what they do, and we should just leave them to it.
And you, Ollie, what do you think?
I think if people identify in different ways, that's them, but as long as they're not taking away the rights of women or affecting children.
Thank you for your views, but before all of that, let's get the news with Ray Addison.
Good afternoon. It's 7 o'clock. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has chaired an emergency Cobra meeting as fierce fighting in Sudan hits its second week. Government forces are battling with a paramilitary group over control of the capital, Khartoum. Sudan's military claims foreign nationals and diplomats, including those from the UK, US, France and China, are to be evacuated. Well, the SNP has appointed Stuart MacDonald as the party's new treasurer following the resignation of MSP Colin Beattie. Mr Beattie stepped down after he was arrested by police investigating SNP finances. He was later released without charge. The party's former chief executive, Peter Murrell, who is also Nicola Sturgeon's husband, was also arrested and questioned before being released. Police are investigating the use of £600,000 in donations meant for the independence referendum. A serving member of the British Armed Forces has appeared in court charged with offences under the Official Secrets Act. 36-year-old Thomas Newsome is accused of sharing highly sensitive military information. He's alleged to have shared a 10-page document through social media to 2 senior officers who had clearance and 1 civilian who didn't. Prosecutors claim if the information was leaked, it would have caused a real and immediate threat to British people outside of the UK. He's due in court again on Friday. And the family of Stephen Lawrence have held a memorial service in Trafalgar Square to mark the 30th anniversary of his murder. The 18-year-old was killed in a racist attack while waiting for a bus in south-east London. It's alleged that the original investigation was hindered by racism and police corruption, meaning it took almost 20 years for 2 of his killers to face justice. The CBI has suspended all policy and membership activity after allegations of rape and sexual assault prompted some of its biggest names to quit. Dozens of members, including John Lewis, NatWest, Jaguar Land Rover and BT, have pulled out of the trade body. The CBI says it shares the shock and revulsion over the allegations. Well, tributes have poured in for Australian entertainer Barry Humphries, who's died at the age of 89. During a 7-decade career, he was best known for his alter egos, including Dame Edna Everage and Sir Les Patterson. Actor Jason Donovan described him as an entertaining genius, and the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, paid tribute to him as the brightest star in a galaxy of personas. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to the Crusade.
Tomorrow is St George's Day, which means that we are in for the annual tradition of people saying, but St George was Turkish. You know, he never even set foot in England. Oh, and did you know that fish and chips aren't English either, and tea and curry? A strange argument, I've always thought, coming primarily from those on the left. The point, of course, is to denigrate us, to undermine any naughty feelings of patriotism that we might have. But it's not the gotcha that they think it is. Because what they're really implying is that something that originates elsewhere doesn't really belong here. It can't really be English or a symbol of national identity, can it, if it's foreign? A strangely nativist implication, don't you think? We've been celebrating St George's Day in this country since the 9th century. Our kings emblazoned their banners with the cross as they marched into battle. For centuries, we prayed to St. George for protection. One of the most famous lines in literature is from Shakespeare's Henry V, when the monarch cries, "For Harry, England and St. George." From the 3rd century until now, it was no secret that St. George was born in what is now Turkey. No one had a problem. In my experience, the people who say, "But St. George wasn't an Englishman," tend to be the same people who simultaneously argue that everything English is bad, but also want you to believe that there's nothing that is distinctively English at all. And certainly, there's nothing to be proud of. Well, to these people, I simply say, no, you're wrong. We've got a tremendous amount to be proud of in this little sceptred isle of ours. The philosopher Sir Roger Scruton talked about the culture of repudiation, our oikophobia, from the Greek meaning a fear or hatred of place and home. Self-hatred, guilt, that instinct to vandalize and chuck away everything valuable that we've inherited from our ancestors. But I tell you this, if we as a country were an individual, always so shrouded in self-loathing, we'd be sent to see a shrink, because it's not healthy to be so unrelentingly negative and cynical about ourselves all the time. Some politicians, who will remain unnamed, seem to cringe and turn up their noses at the sight of St. George's flags hanging from the windows of this great nation. They think there's something embarrassing about it, a bit dirty even. They can't tell the difference between the far right and good, natural, healthy, patriotic feelings. Call them snobs or Philistines, it doesn't matter. Let them say whatever they want to say. But tomorrow is a time to celebrate, not just with those living today, but with all those who came before us, to feel proud of this great country and our many achievements over so many centuries in this shared home of ours. If some people can't appreciate the beauty of simple patriotism, that's their problem. But let's not let it stop us. St. George, pray for us, because by George, we need it. Welcome to the Common Sense Crusade. I'm Emma Webb, standing in for Calvin Robinson this week. Joining me this evening, my wonderful dualist, former Labour advisor and writer Scarlett Maguire, and media personality and commentator Ollie London. Welcome to you both. Ollie's self-identification attracted worldwide attention and stirred debate over whether a person can be transracial, identifying as a different race. And that leads us to this week's duel. You've heard of transgenderism. You may have even seen examples of transracialism like Rachel Dolezal, a white activist who was accused of being a race faker after going to great lengths to present as a black woman. What about transableism? Believing that they are imposters in their own body, some transabled identifying people have sought to become disabled by choice. And then there are the adult baby community, which doesn't really require any elaboration. But what about transspeciesism? Take a look. This is from Japan, a gentleman called Toko who lives inside a realistic dog costume, drinks and eats from a bowl, and even plays fetch. One of our producers here told me that he's putting in an order for an outfit tonight. But there is a serious question to all of this. Where do we draw the line on the right to identify? So let's get stuck into the duel. Scarlett, if you follow this logic, where do you draw the line? Do we stop saying, I'm going to say that you're a dog because you identify as a dog?
Well, I mean, I do think it's quite difficult, right? Because clearly that man believes he's a dog. I mean, I've just called him a man, so I'm whatever it is. But he believes he's a dog. And what I wonder is, does it do anybody any harm? And surely that should be the question we're asking, is if people want to identify or feel that they really do identify as other things. I mean, I remember taking my 2-year-old on a massive hike in Yosemite Park, and she decided she was a dog. And for 8 miles, she walked as a dog, and we got through the hike. And actually, you know, she is now a young woman.
There's a difference, though, isn't there, between children pretending to be a dog and grown men paying 40-odd grand for a dog costume. Do you think that, Ollie, that there's something about this is actually quite offensive, particularly on the transracialism?
You know, I do. So when I was going through my identity struggle, I was basically saying, you know, if all these people with gender ideology are saying all these different identities, what's wrong with me doing that? Obviously, I've come to realise that was a mistake and I was struggling with my identity, but it really does draw the question, because if all these other people are saying you can identify as a dog, there's a man in Japan that's a wolf, you know, where do you draw the line? And, you know, I was kind of saying that against these woke people, you know, why can't I say at the time that I felt like I wanted to be a Korean pop star? What's the harm in that if everyone else is doing it? But it's really getting, you know, bad now, because we're now seeing grown men dressing up as babies, wearing diapers, you know, having dummies and sucking from bottles and wanting to be respected as a baby. I mean, that's a bit creepy. But, you know, the dog thing seems a little bit harmless, but it's where do we draw the line, you know, because it's only going to lead to more people having more unusual identities. And I think the men identifying as kids, that's the dangerous thing.
What do you think about this? Adults who pretend to be babies, they have somebody who looks after them like they're a baby. Do you think there's something sort of a bit creepy about this, or possibly even a bit offensive to people? You can imagine that. So you can imagine someone who's transgender wanting to say, well, don't lump me in with these people who identify as babies or who want to cut limbs off.
Oh, no, I can absolutely understand a transgender person who says, I was born as a man, but I've never been happy in that, and I've always felt female, and now I'm going to come out as a female. And the difference between that and a grown man saying, I want to wear nappies, but I still think that actually, in the end, if it's not harming anybody, that's okay. I mean, I think there is a difference. I think Ollie's right about the whole racial thing. And I do understand why a lot of black people were incredibly insulted about Rachel, whatever her name is, saying she was black. Because actually, the other thing is, you know, she was getting credibility as a black person when actually she was white. And for her to say, but I feel black, seems very different to saying, but I feel female. I mean, if
But is it that different?
Well, I mean, I do think that there is serious, gender dysmorphia, right? That I don't think it's massive, but I do think there are people who feel that they were born into the wrong sex, and they have a pretty horrible life until they come out. And I remember, I mean, decades ago, in a newsroom I was in, there was a guy who was transitioning. Now, you know, he wasn't some woke person, actually. He was a Tory councillor. And the women were incredibly understanding. And when he decided to come wear a dress and come into our loo, it was fine. And actually, we understood this was somebody who was trying to sort himself out, instead of saying, oh, no, this is all ghastly. And I mean, you know, I think Ollie got it absolutely right. There's something really creepy about men who think they're babies, right? I mean, not somebody I'd want to be friends with, but actually also really sad. I mean, what sort of life do they have?
Scarlett mentioned gender dysphoria. Would you say that you had experienced a sort of racial dysphoria as well? So actually, when it comes to drawing the line between transgenderism and other forms of transism, that actually it's not that straightforward?
Well, you know, when people are saying you can identify in any way you want, and, you know, the LGBT community, and now there's like 72 different genders. So I was just like, you know, why not? Because I was living in Korea, I liked that culture. I just wanted to look a certain way. So for me, it was more about fitting in with that particular society. It wasn't anything necessarily to do with race or anything. I just wanted to feel connected to somewhere where I liked. But the issue now is we're seeing so many cases of gender dysphoria, which, like Scarlett said, there's, you know, that we know there's trans people, there's been trans people for millennia throughout history, but the issue now is that with all of this self-identification, with this push from all angles, so you have schools, you have TikTok, you have Hollywood and even Disney, you know, promoting these things to change people's identities, to actively force them to change their opinions and think, oh, maybe I am the wrong gender. So that's the real issue. You know, not the people that have generally been transgender their whole life, but the issue of it being pushed on kids that wouldn't be thinking about these things otherwise.
You've recently as well come out as being quite publicly Christian as well. Has that had an effect on how you understand basically coming to terms with who you are, and not as many of these people seem to feel the need to demand that other people recognise them as something that they're not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was really a turning point for me. And basically, you know, I'd struggled with my identity. I'd had gender dysphoria, body dysmorphia, all of these different things, depression with the way I looked. So, you know, in order to tackle that, I needed an outlet. And, you know, going to church was a really positive experience. The Christian community were incredibly welcoming. And, you know, I needed that at the time. And it's really helped me have perspective in life and think, you know, what I was doing was self-harming almost, in the sense that I was having all these surgeries and doing these things. It was self-harming. And, you know, I've learned to deal with those issues and actually think, you know, maybe I can help people, maybe I can help others that are struggling. And look, we get there's people that have different identities and stuff, but the thing now is when it's being pushed on so many young people. So, you know, I've lived through these experiences. I know what it's like firsthand to struggle with your identity, but now it's like I'm trying to help kids, you know, using my newfound faith, trying to speak to people and, you know, kind of find a kind of common ground where we can, you know, make women happy, make trans people happy, just protect everyone basically. That's very important.
Final thoughts, Scarlett. Do you think that actually it could be harmful to affirm somebody who says that they're a dog?
No, I mean,
harmful to that person to affirm their...
No, I mean, I would say that person has serious problems if they think they're a dog. I think men who think they're babies have serious problems. I think there's an enormous difference between, for teenagers, provided they're not taking drugs, right? I mean, I don't mean fun or illegal drugs, but I mean prescription drugs. Provided the thing about being a teenager is you come out, you're all sorts of different people, you don't know who you are. And I think we just have to stand back and let people find out who they are. And obviously it took Ollie a long time, and you now find that you are. And lots of people find it out in different ways. And I had a complete tomboy as a daughter who is now, she's now a proud feminist. But I mean, I think it was fine, and I watched her go through it.
Thank you so much, Ollie and Scarlett, for an excellent duel. But unfortunately, we have to move on because we've got a lot to get onto. So tomorrow is St George's Day. Unfortunately, Nottingham's St George's Day parade has been cancelled this year. It's just one of many celebrations across the land that has been cancelled because of costs. I actually wanted to buy a St George's Day flag for this show, but I couldn't find one anywhere, which I think is very telling, though I do hear that Darren Grimes managed to get his mitts on one. St George's Day always seems to play second fiddle to St Patrick when it comes to our national celebrations. Are we, as a country, undervaluing and forgetting our patron saint? Are we a bit cringing about English patriotism because we're afraid, perhaps, of being perceived as far-right or racist? Earlier, I took to Twitter and asked, should St George's Day be a public bank holiday? You've another half hour or so to cast your votes on that, and I will bring you the results at the end of the show. There's plenty more to come this evening on our Common Sense Crusade. Next, we'll be heading to Birmingham to get the latest from the New Culture Forum's 2023 conference and asking, what have we got to be proud of?
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GBNews because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade with me, Emma Webb, standing in for Calvin Robinson here on GB News, Britain's news channel. I was in Birmingham this morning speaking at the New Culture Forum's 2023 conference entitled Our Future, A New Vision for Britain. The conference was a celebration of patriotic feeling, reflecting on our country's history and looking forward to our future with optimism instead of the usual cynicism. I'm delighted to be joined from Birmingham by Peter Whittle, the founder and director of the New Culture Forum. Good evening, Peter. Long time no see.
Hi there. Hi there, Emma, and it was a wonderful speech you gave too. Thank you very much. It's been a fantastic day here in Birmingham because...
Can you tell us a bit more about the purpose of the conference?
Well, I mean, basically, the point is what we don't want to be at this conference, Emma, is kind of like just constantly whining and talking about all the problems we face. They are legion. I mean, the point really is that the people who came here today, it's over now, but we had hundreds of people here. They are all patriotic people. They're not racist. They're not bigots. They're not any of these things. They care desperately about the future of the country. And of course, they want to feel optimism. And indeed, so do I. And so that's really the point of our conference today. And we have it every year around St. George's Day. St. George's Day, of course, is tomorrow, Sunday. But one of the main things about it was basically how can we, if you like, bring this country together again, but also in a way which totally celebrates our past and our history. No shame. There should be no shame about what is a wonderful heritage.
And you did a video I think it was a year or so ago, you actually showed at last year's conference, listing all of the things that we have to be proud of as a nation. What do we have to be proud of, Peter?
Well, I mean, where do you start, Emma? I mean, where do you start? Extraordinary. We almost invented, in some ways, the modern world. That's no exaggeration. Extraordinary. The scientific method, wonderful literature. The Industrial Revolution, extraordinary scientific invention, brilliant literature. It is quite extraordinary what this country actually has done considering as well its size. We tend to forget that. You know, this is a very small island. And I think that the point is really with the New Culture Forum and the people who are here today is that they realize that, and they really are appalled and dismayed by the way in which even being just gently proud of this is now considered something which is verboten. And that's something we have to change. And it's certainly something we have to change if we want to survive as a nation.
Why do you think, Peter, people have become so cringy about English patriotism? Because patriotism used to be viewed as a virtue, and something obviously quite dramatic has changed.
Well, exactly, Emma, it is a virtue. It's a good thing to have. It's a communal feeling. It's not belligerent. It's not aggressive. It is just a sense of where we are, where we come from, and what is good about us. It brings people together. It's a community. The reason that I think that it's been actually in a bad way recently, it goes back years. It's not actually necessarily to do with wokery or any of the things that we tend to discuss now. The kind of downgrading of British patriotism has been there since the Second World War. And a lot of that was to do with the idea that the nation state was a bad thing, and the British nation state particularly was particularly bad. That's happened over, what, 5 decades, 6 decades. And so consequently, if the culture stops teaching its history and stops teaching reasons to be proud, you will end up in the situation in which we are now. I think the difference is now is that we are seeing what is an outright attack on that. I think it's become much more acute.
I'm going to bring the panel in now on this. Scarlett, what do you think we have to be proud of as a nation? Do you think we have reason to be optimistic?
I certainly think we have reason to be optimistic. I think that we can do great things. What worries me actually a bit is you going on about St George's when we do have we have Scottish and Welsh, but if you look at the St George's flag, I mean, when I feel really happy about it is when we've got a football team and you see people of all colours raising the flag and feeling absolutely, at that time it's English. I mean, it's the English team, and I think people who say that we're not proud, but I also think there's nothing wrong with understanding the mistakes we made in our history. I mean, there is nothing wrong with understanding that actually we did make a lot of money from slavery and slavery is evil, right? That we did make a mistake when we gave independence to the Indians and 1 million people died. That I think there's nothing wrong with understanding history as nuances instead of just a pageantry of we were right, we were always right.
Ollie, do you think that patriotism is a virtue?
Yeah, I think it's very important to have patriotism as well, but sadly in the modern society it is being eroded. When you see, the English flag, people will say, oh, you're right-wing, you're racist. This is a beautiful country. We should be celebrating our history. We should also be looking at the bad things in history and learning from those mistakes. But every country does bad things in history, every population has been through something difficult. But we need to come together. We need to remember what makes this country special. You've got the monarchy, you've got, of course, fish and chips, you've got an amazing history that goes back thousands and thousands of years. We had the Romans here as well. So there's so many great things here to celebrate. So we should be coming together as a nation to be more proud of it, because so many young people these days, they can't tell you what it means to be British, because they're not really being taught that in schools. They're not being taught about this beautiful, rich history of this nation. So I think we need to get back to that. And the football, like Scarlett said, brings people together. That's a great thing, but we need more of that. So like tomorrow, St George's Day, that should be a day of celebration, barbecues if the weather's nice, and a celebration, get the flags out, enjoy the day.
There we are. Patriotism is a virtue. Thank you so much, Peter Whittle. That was Peter Whittle there from the New Culture Forum. And thank you also for having me to give a speech earlier today. And thank you for your time this evening.
Emma.
Now you can go back and have a drink with everybody else. So,
thank you.
Plenty more to come this evening on the Common Sense Crusade. Next up, we will be joined by 2 brilliant women to debate whether transgender women should be allowed to join the Women's Institute. That's next on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know, Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
Right, folks, that was a spicy one, wasn't it?
With us four, plus a special guest.
Sometimes she has to stick her foot in it. Sometimes she has to say things as they are.
Sometimes I think we should keep the refugees and send the pensioners to Rwanda. Then we'd be in a much better state.
Well, Benjamin, that is...
The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Britain's news channel.
Calvin Robinson. Despite facing a revolt from members, the Women's Institute says it will not change its policy of welcoming, quote, anyone who is living as a woman to the organisation. Trustees of the organisation have been criticised for forcing this decision on local branches without a vote, following advice from campaign groups. Earlier this week, former Conservative leader William Hague also faced a backlash after he told women to get over their concerns. To discuss this, I am joined by author and broadcaster Amy Nickel and journalist and campaigner Joe Bartosh. Thank you guys so much for joining me tonight. So, Amy, can you tell me, why do you think that this is a good idea from the leadership of the WI?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me, and what a great first show, Emma. Well, this subject is a bit of a non-argument, really, because the WI have been allowing transgender women to participate since the 1970s, and there have been absolutely no problems. It's the Women's Institute, so of course they're going to be welcoming to all women, and to do anything otherwise would not only be wrong, but would also be not in agreement with the Equalities Act. Since 2010, we've allowed transgender women equal access to women's spaces, which would include the Women's Institute. So if they want to go and make some jam and do some knitting, whatever they're up to, then of course they should be welcome, as should we all us women.
But letting trans people into women's spaces isn't really in line with the Equality Act, is it, Joe?
No, it isn't. And I would also add that what defines a trans woman is that they're a man. I mean, they're male. I couldn't be a trans woman because I'm a woman. So effectively, by allowing men into the Women's Institute, they have made it mixed sex. And I think that matters because, there are very few places that are single sex left. And with regard to the fact that it has been effectively mixed sex for a long time, yes, it has, and that's fair. But what the current chief executive has done is she's put forward a lot of edicts, she's put forward a lot of sort of so-called inclusion policies without any sort of democratic process. And then she's complained about being dragged into the culture wars. Well, frankly, she's the one that fired the first shot. So whether or not the membership were to vote that it's a good idea to make it mixed sex or otherwise, I think that democratic process has not been gone through, and that's not acceptable.
Amy, she's the one who fired the first shot. That's what Joe said there. So don't you think that the leadership of the WI should have asked the membership of the WI whether they actually wanted this change? Because clearly this is something new, and they do seem to have chosen to drag themselves into the culture wars. It's not those objecting who are to blame here. This is, after all, the Women's Institute. It almost seems like a joke.
I mean, first of all, I completely draw issue at the fact that you could call a trans woman a man. I think that is fundamentally wrong. All you've got to do is think of women like Paris Lees, India Willoughby, Sean Fay. Look up any of those women and tell me that they're not going to be welcome in a WI meeting should they so wish to go. And to call trans women men is, we're not going to agree on anything if that's your original premise that you're coming from. It's also not recognised by medicine, science. The whole start of the argument is wrong, but I think that Melissa Green, the leader of the Women's Institute, has made it clear that she doesn't want to be dragged in this culture war because it's also she's downplayed the actual what has any of the criticism that has come from within the group. I'm not even convinced that there was any membership uproar. I think there were 2 complaints, one of which was from a non-member. I'm not a member of the Women's Institute. I don't think Joe is a member of the Women's Institute. Emma, I don't think you are. I mean, really, let's leave this up to the Women's Institute. They've made it clear that they are welcoming to trans women. Let's leave it. It's not even up for debate.
I'd like to leave it to the Women's Institute, but it seems that the members are not getting a say. Joe, you wrote a very good article about this in Spike. This isn't just one or 2 people complaining. This was a declaration that was signed by a number of women, and isn't this fundamentally about the right to associate?
Yeah, I mean, it's protected under human rights legislation. I mean, that's something very, very fundamental that women have fought for. When the Women's Institute was formed, women didn't even have to vote. So, we knew what a woman was then, and we still do now, if we're honest. And I think when you have a man in a group, quite often they dominate, and whether that's nature or nurture, and however they identify, they do. And if that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't have seen, for example, a man who was put on the front of the cover of the Women's Institute's Internal House magazine. Now that's kind of quite astonishing, really. And I think it's not that I'm worried they're going to wave their willies in the jam. I mean, it's not that. The point is they are men, and if you introduce them into a women's group, that's then a mixed sex group. And 700 women within the Women's Institute signed that petition. So it's not a fringe thing. It matters, and it's representative of what has happened within institutions across society. That lobby groups have changed policies by stealth, and there is quite often a massive disjuncture, a disparity between the sort of elite, if you like, at the top of organisations who are forcing this on members. And if the members turned around and voted to accept that, that would be absolutely fine. That would be up to them. But the fact is, it hasn't been done like that. It's been imposed upon them, and that isn't acceptable.
Amy, the 1970s, there have been absolutely no problems. And all you're doing is you're policing genitals at the moment, Joe. You're reducing people to what's in their
What's living as a woman? I'm curious.
If I give you an example of a woman like Katie Montgomery, Sean Fay, Paris, are you happy with your position to call those women men?
Amy,
are you happy to call those men women?
This to the members of the WI.
The law is happy to call them women. They go through life as women. They experience the same misogyny that you experience as a woman. It is absolutely farcical that you could call them men.
Of course they're men. Well, of course they're men. I mean, that's ludicrous. Of course they're men. I mean, sorry, get the power of basic doesn't make you a woman.
We just assume you're reducing people to their gender.
Lesbians can have penises, because frankly, I'm pretty pissed off as a woman in a same-sex relationship that I can't now join any lesbian or groups of bisexual women without men coming along and saying they're lesbians. That is not acceptable. That is male dominance. That is male supremacy.
That's the problem, isn't it, Amy? That this is undermining sex-based rights, and that also has an implication on homosexual couples, doesn't it?
Of course, I think the implications that it has on homosexual couples is a completely different issue that I didn't actually expect to get into today. However, I think that if you cannot admit that we have gender incongruence and there are people who are going to live in a gender that isn't the sex they were assigned at birth, and if you're going to kind of laugh at that as a concept, then that isn't progression. And I think what the Women's Institute have done, which is, you talked about how when women didn't have the vote and we still had the Women's Institute, again, they're proving themselves to be incredibly progressive and accurate and for women.
I'm going to bring my panel. I'm going to bring my panel in here. Ollie London. From a Christian perspective, what do you think of this issue?
I think it's very important to protect women's spaces. While I understand about inclusion, this is a women's institute. It's founded by women for women. So women should be able to be in their own spaces, like their own restrooms, their own toilets, their own locker rooms. And this is, again, an erosion of women's rights, because we're seeing time and time again women's rights being taken away. And look, there are people that are transgender, but the problem is now that people that self-identify with no checks and balances can join the institute. Just the other day, all across the news, it was in the Daily Mail, this biological man that identifies as a woman was accepted to the Women's Institute. They posted about it on Twitter, posted their official confirmation email. This man had previously tweeted he had a kill list to murder 50 women's activists in the UK. So this is now a person that's a member of this organisation. I think that's wrong.
We've got time just for one quick comment from Scarlett.
I think this is one of the saddest stories that for decades, transgender women have been going very quietly to women's institutes. They've had a really tough time in their lives. They've found friendship. They've done it very quietly. And now suddenly this has become a culture war. And for most transgender women, they don't want to be anywhere near a culture war. When I read it last week, I just was profoundly sad for those transgender women who find themselves in a fight that they don't want anything to do with. And what is so awful about it is it's picking on people who can't defend themselves.
Thank you so much, panel, for your views, and thank you so much for your time this evening. That was Joe Bartosz and Amy Nickel. Thank you so much for your panel, for your company panel all evening. That was former Labour advisor and writer Scarlett Maguire and media personality Ollie London. Before we take the final break, let's have a look at what you've had to say about today's topics. Phil says, you are correct. St George may not be English, but St Patrick was. I've never noticed this get in the way of a 7th of March bash. It's one in 365 chance Jesus was born on the 25th of December. I've never noticed anyone whinge about this. Bill says, hi, Emma. Of course, we need to be proud. What we didn't invent is not worth talking about. Don't let these wokes try to bring us down. Deb says, Emma, well done on your first monologue this evening. Spot on. You can come again. Thank you. So coming up in the final part of my Common Sense Crusade this week, we'll be joined by historian Martin Whittock to discuss the history and origin of St George's Day. Thank you so much.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope? It's very much so. And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the final part of the Common Sense Crusade. With tomorrow being St George's Day, I took to Twitter and asked, should St George's Day be a public bank holiday? The results are in. 79.4% of you said yes, whilst 20.6% of you said no. Interesting. Lots of you have been sending in your thoughts on this. Chris says, more needs to be done than that too. Every government and council building should be made to fly the flag at all times. God Save the King should be sung every day at schools and assembly. I agree. Couldn't agree more. We also have a comment here from Nemo who says, St George doesn't represent modern Britain. We should bring back St Cuthbert, my favourite saint. I love that, but I wouldn't want to dispossess St George. And finally, we have another viewer who says, St Jacob Rees-Mogg Day should definitely be a holiday. I wonder what he would think about that. Thank you all so much for sending in your views. St George's Day takes place on the 23rd of April every year to mark the martyrdom of England's patron saint. St George was killed in the 4th century for refusing to make a sacrifice to pagan gods. Since then, his tomb in the Roman province of Palestine, now Israel, has been the centre of pilgrimage for well over 1,000 years, and his feast day has been celebrated in England since the 9th century. To discuss the history around the celebration, I'm joined by historian and author Martin Whittock. Thank you so much for joining me, Martin.
Good evening, great to be with you.
So can you tell us a bit about who St George was as an historical figure?
Well, the first record for him appears in about the 5th century, might be as early as the 4th century. And it tells the story of a Greek-speaking officer, Roman officer from the Greek part of the Roman Empire, who was in the Imperial Guard, the Praetorian Guard, who was martyred for his faith. At this point, there's no record of the dragon. That doesn't appear until the 11th century, quite a few centuries later, when we have a document from Georgia. That's an interesting connection, isn't it? Georgia. There is a connection, by the way. And that then talks about him slaying a dragon that was eating maidens in what we'd now call modern Libya. But the original story is that he is a Roman officer martyred for his faith, killed for his faith under one of the persecutions of the pagan Roman emperors. And that cult takes off. It's very popular because it's a dramatic story. But we don't know very much about him at all beyond that. We'd like to know more, but we don't. What comes next, of course, is the fascinating history of what people do with the legend of St. George, or the reality of St. George, for that matter.
So can you tell us a bit more about when that dragon myth came into the picture? Because obviously there's a lot of symbolism there, and it's the same with St. Patrick, the association with snakes. There's a sort of symbolic element of chaos and driving out chaos. So where did that come into the picture, and was that partly responsible for the popularity of St. George? Because obviously he was already being celebrated in this country before the 11th century when that story came about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In the Christian scriptures, dragons, and in the Jewish scriptures too, dragons, serpents are associated with evil. So this idea of him slaying the dragon probably conveys the idea of him having victory over evil. And it first appears in a document that's produced in Georgia in the Caucasus in the 11th century. But he really picks up and he really takes off after the Crusades, because although his military career is not a big thing of the original stories, he is a soldier. And at the time of the Crusades, a lot of fighting kings want to have a patron saint, somebody who is a soldier like themselves. And so in that way, he goes on to have quite an after story. So in 1222, under Henry III, we have the first royally sponsored promotion of St. George, a royal saint. Before that, the English royal saint is St. Edward. And it's interesting, when the king is crowned on May the 6th, it will be the crown of St. Edward that's put on his throne. But Edward was not a warrior king. Crusaders wanted a warrior patron, you see. So 1222, we have this promotion of him. It's then picked up by Edward III, who's another warrior king in England in the 14th century, and by Henry V in the 15th century. And he's promoted and promoted. And the idea of him being a soldier, also fighting the dragon, is very, very popular. We know, for example, before the Reformation, there are what are called St. George's ridings on the 23rd of April. People come out dressed as the dragon. They see him kill the dragon. It's all tremendous. It's all tremendously popular. And then at the Reformation, it takes an absolute nosedive, because basically the new Protestants in England say, well, what's the evidence for this St. George? What do we actually really know about him? And suddenly the thin basis becomes his biggest Achilles heel. So it's not the dragon that's the problem for St. George, it's the fact that we don't know enough about him. And in 1552, he's taken away from the celebration of saints. It's decided we don't know enough about him, we're not too sure about these saints anyway. And in the Reformation, his career collapses. In the 17th century, it fights back a bit. Towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, it's on a bit more of a roll, but he never has quite the PR push behind him that St. Patrick and St. David and St. Andrew, who never went to Scotland, had behind him. So here we have the fascinating history of St. George over the centuries. A few ups, a few downs, and certainly not quite the royally sponsored saint that he once was before the Reformation.
St. George seems to have fallen by the wayside. Let me bring in Emily Carver very, very briefly, Emily. Do you think that there's something a bit cringy about wrapping yourself in a flag and celebrating St. George's Day?
Well, I must admit, Emma, that I am very patriotic, but having grown up in North London, it wasn't really the done thing. No flagpole in the garden, no waving of the flag. But you know what? I quite like it when others do it. But I don't think you'd catch me with one wrapped around me.
I'm tarnishing your reputation by putting Darren Grimes'
tarnishing my reputation.
Darren Grimes' flag, I must add. He managed to find one. Thank you so much, Emily, for joining me. And thank you, historian and author Martin Whittock. Thank you so much for your time today. You've been watching Calvin's Common Sense Crusade with me, Emma Webb. Calvin will be back with you next Saturday at 7 p.m. Next up, it's the Saturday 5, but before